John Harbaugh is out and Jesse Minter is in, and Harbaugh broke his silence on being replaced by Jesse Minter and what he brings to the Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Ravens. Welcome into the show. I'm your host, Kevin Oestreicher of Ravens Wire, here with you on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and now the #1 sports podcast network. Appreciate everybody for being here, making Locked On Ravens a part of your day, and thank you to all the everydayers, the first-time listeners. If you're somewhere in the middle, thank you as well. We have 5 days a week plus more of daily Ravens coverage and content. On today's show, it's a jam-packed episode, as John Harbaugh broke his silence, I guess, on the Jesse Minter hire and what Minter brings to the Ravens and his thoughts on the move. In the second part of the show, we'll talk about the Ravens rounding out their coaching staff with some more hires. And then finally, we'll talk about some offseason priorities. And here to do that with me today, it is Ken McKusick, Film Study Ravens of the Film Study Podcast. And Ken, you and I haven't talked on this show since about mid-October. I know you and I have done stuff after the fact. We talked about the cornerback situation in Baltimore on your show. But a lot has changed since October. Obviously, a tough end of the season for the Ravens. They decide to move on from John Harbaugh. They bring Jesse Minter in, and that's just the beginning of everything that's going on and is going to go on with this team.
A frenetic pace since Harbaugh was fired here in terms of a hiring of the entire process, speeding up, going to a second round, hiring a bunch of assistant coaches now, and it's been incredibly fast. You know, the Super Bowl has just ended, so it's been a 5-week period. Basically, the Ravens have gotten it all done.
Yeah, and it's something that here in Baltimore, we haven't had to go through a coaching process like this in 18 years. So it's kind of getting acclimated to all that and how fast everything moves. And you're right, it certainly has moved at a really fast pace. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Ravens rounding out their staff in the second part of the show, some more assistants hired on board. But in the first part of the show here, Ken, I wanted to get your thoughts on Jesse Minter, and specifically John Harbaugh wanted a couple of different Baltimore outlets over the course of Wednesday, the Ryan Ripken Show, Be More Sports Podcast, Glenn Clark were just a couple there. And he talked a lot about Jesse Minter. He was asked a question about it. All right, well, obviously John Harbaugh brought on Jesse Minter to his staff, and Minter was there in Baltimore. This is Minter's second stint with the team. And on the Ryan Ripken Show is the clip that I'll read out here. He ended up talking about Minter and what he brings to the table. He said, quote, "I really like this hire. I was following it. I'm interested, of course. Now the Ravens are still the Ravens in a lot of ways, and all the things that were built stand probably. And I think Jesse will put a stamp on it, his personality, everything he does. The values and principles go back through his time in Baltimore." Now, I think it's a unique situation, Ken, where the guy that it's not totally unique, but the guy who is replacing you in a certain spot worked under you for a couple of seasons. And so Harbaugh kind of talking about that. You know, there was the thing that was revealed during the press conferences for the Ravens that Harbaugh had texted and said that, oh, Minter's should be the guy for the job or whatever that was. But for you, when Harbaugh says, Jesse putting a stamp on things, but things will stay, like the Ravens are still going to be the Ravens in a lot of ways, do you think that's true, or do you feel like that we're going to see some pretty major switch ups in some categories?
Well, it's not true because John Harbaugh says it's true. And there's one key element I don't think that they've really gone through, and that is the commitment to a fullback as part of the offense. So we'll see if that element of the offense really stays the same. But I would say otherwise, that a lot of the coaching hires tell you exactly that the Ravens way and the good elements of Harbaugh's tenure should largely be kept, and hopefully new things will be layered in as Harbaugh intimates that Minter will bring and be new. But I look at the hiring of Anthony Weaver as a big Ravens way hiring. The Minter hiring himself is a big Ravens way hiring. He was here for 4 years, of course, from 17 to 20, 18 to 21, whatever it was. So he certainly is a guy who brings that. They're keeping Anthony Levine. That certainly is a very big deal. He was promoted officially to a special teams coordinator today, I guess. The hiring of Ledford and the poaching of Eddie Faulkner are extremely good and complementary coaching hires specifically for the run game. Now, Faulkner is a huge missed tackles force guy, and that's been like Henry's biggest weakness last year. He had only had a 14% missed tackle rate. It's 0.14 missed tackles per play is what I'm doing there. So it's not exactly a missed tackle rate. But the 0.14 missed tackles per play were the second lowest of his entire career, only worse in his rookie year. Eddie Faulkner should actually be able to help Derrick Henry be better at that element. Ledford is a terrific scheme guy, and he schemed Bijan Robinson to the highest success rate ever in 300-plus carries at 60.2%. That was in 2024. You add that guy to Lamar Jackson, who's improved every running back in terms of success rate. I see the Ravens going back to more of a grinding, high drive success rate. That means every first down, how often do you get as a percentage, you get a first down or touchdown after that. I see them going back to that type of an offense rather than being strictly a big play offense. So I think that'll be a positive development, and it should really help the defense for that to happen. So I think this big Ravens ways hires across the board.
Yeah, 100%. And John Harbaugh even talked about it on the Be More Sports podcast. It's a quote, I think Anthony Weaver is a perfect hire. Anthony Weaver is a brilliant hire because he complements Jesse so perfectly well, personality-wise, position-wise. Called the Anthony Levine hire a superstar hire as well. So it really feels like Minter is tapping into that coaching pipeline and staying true to what he said during his press conference of not just guys who know X's and O's and have been there and have that experience, but also guys who just are players guys and get along with guys and are able to continue that culture that was already built. And so some of the stuff, again, John Harbaugh, we know, Ken, did not call plays. He had delegated out and hired coordinators and had them do that. It's going to be a little different under Jesse Minter. And that's one of the things it is. John Harbaugh's talking about the Ravens stay and the Ravens in a lot of ways. Well, that is going to be different with Jesse Minter calling the plays as a head coach. Diving into his Chargers defense a little bit and some of these other coaching hires that he's had, based off what we saw, let's just narrow it down to last season. How do you think things will be a little bit different this year in terms of maybe how they're utilizing certain positions? Like you said, fullback, we'll have to see if that's a position that the Ravens value or not on the offensive side of the ball. But the reality, Ken, like you were kind of alluding to, is that some players and positions were Harbaugh players and positions. Other guys in other situations, they're not going to be Minter guys and Minter positions. So that's something I'm really trying to hammer home.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity when this happens to restructure your coaching ranks broadly. And Minter is bringing in some guys he's worked with a lot. I think one of the really interesting hires on defense is the hiring of PJ Volker from Navy. Now, Volker and Minter had their careers intertwined earlier on for both of them. But it's pretty clear to me what the setup is, that Volker will be the eyes from the booth. Minter has to be on the field now as a head coach, and Weaver will be on the field because he's a player's coach and he wants to directly interact with the players. But Volker is going to be the trusted voice over the headset. He'll be the guy, and he'll be defensive coordinator in waiting if anything were to go wrong. I think he would take over that role, which of course is a subordinate role anyway, with Minter calling the plays. But it's one that he's going to have the voice that Minter really wants to hear play by play, is like, what's going wrong in our secondary. He can see it a lot better than Minter can from the sideline.
Yeah, it's going to be a really interesting dynamic, especially because we know that there are so many connections between Minter and some of these guys, and even like Declan Doyle and some of these guys on the offensive side of the ball, which we'll get to a little bit later in the show. But in terms of Lamar and kind of how this is going to work on the offensive side of the ball with Declan Doyle coming in and the system that he runs, and I guess Ben Johnson called the plays for, obviously, in Chicago, but Doyle still having a role in the development of guys and how that offense ran. I think the big thing is, what is that next iteration of Lamar Jackson with him already being so good and being a two-time MVP? And John Harbaugh talked about that a little bit on the Ryan Ripken show, saying, quote, "I'm proud of Lamar, proud of what we accomplished together, proud of the quarterback he's become and what he's done. We were so close. We were right there and couldn't quite get it done. Now let's get the next evolution of Lamar and see what can be done." So for you, Ken, what is that next evolution of Lamar Jackson, and how can the Declan Doyle system help Lamar maybe reach even new heights?
So evolution, not revolution, is important differentiation here. So I think Lamar will continue to evolve as he has his entire career. Every camp, he's come with something new about his game. That's been special. Between 18 and 19, he had big changes in terms of what he could do as a passer, accuracy. He still works with a quarterback guru, and he spends a lot of time trying to figure out the next season. Now, this season was lost in a lot of ways to injuries. He's going to have to, I think, be able to see again where he is injury-wise. I would anticipate, because both Doyle and Lombardi come from the Peyton tree, that there'll be more on schedule passing. That was, obviously they leaned into who Drew Brees was to have a lot of that in New Orleans, but basically, I expect them to want to have more on schedule passing. There's certain players that benefits, like Bateman, for example, who should be in better shape with his route running, helping the team more in that situation. But I'm not sure it's perfect for Lamar. If they want to completely change him into being late career Peyton Manning or Tom Brady, where he fakes and then throws to his first read on a regular basis, you're losing the value of Lamar Jackson. So I don't think they're going to completely revolutionize who he is. I think it's a matter of another layering, another kind of a wave that goes a few inches further onto the shore than it did previously to get him to a few more on time passes, but not big changes in who Lamar Jackson is.
His arm is so valuable, but so are his legs. They work in tandem together because he's such a great thrower of the football as well as a great runner. And I remember all the crazy takes about, with Lamar and, him, he's not a quarterback. He can't throw. He can't do this. Of course, he's proven those wrong 10 billion times over again. But part of the thing that does make Lamar is, yes, he can beat you up from the pocket, but you have to, as a defense, take into account that threat of Lamar, which is what we've seen over and over again, Ken, when they run a read option with Derrick Henry, for example, and Lamar is a threat with the football. You have 2 or 3 guys just following him and are out of a play. And Derrick Henry, that's 2 or 3 less guys he has to worry about in the box because they're following a guy that they're so scared of having the football and being so dynamic with it. So again, I think that Declan Doyle can elevate Lamar Jackson even further. But yes, in terms of just making him be a completely different player, I don't think that's the right way to go either. Right now, the Ravens, there are a lot of different things that are cooking up for him right now, but that staff is pretty much complete. In fact, I think it is practically all the way done. So coming up in the second part of the show, Ken and I will continue to talk about some of the other hires the Ravens made, particularly on Wednesday, to round out their units. So be sure to stay tuned. Plenty coming up on Locked On Ravens. First, the show is brought to you by TurboTax. Tax season doesn't have to take over your life. This year, TurboTax is making it easier than ever. Just hand things off and move on with your day. With TurboTax Full Service, you can have your taxes done for you by a trusted local expert, start to finish, without the stress or guesswork. Instead of spending hours trying to figure out forms, you can meet with a local TurboTax expert in person or connect online. They handle everything from W-2s to self-employed forms and work to get you every deduction. You can upload your documents, go about your day, and get updates right in the TurboTax app. It's a huge time saver and gives real peace of mind knowing an expert is handling it. For a limited time, you can have your taxes done by a local TurboTax expert. Just $150 all in. If a TurboTax expert didn't file for you last year, just file by February 28. Take taxes off your plate and get back to your life. Visit TurboTax.com/local to book your appointment today. Back here, Locked On Ravens, Kevin Oestreicher and Ken McKusick still talking with you here on this Thursday edition of the show. Thanks so much for being here, making Locked On Ravens a part of your day and your first listen each and every single day. We do have 5 days a week plus more of daily Ravens coverage and content for you here. Plus, if you want some extra add-on content, we have the Everydayer Club here on Locked On Ravens. So if you're interested in that, link is in the description down below, as well as on the Locked On website on the Locked On Ravens page. Ken, the Ravens, they made that decision to promote Anthony Levine to special teams coordinator. A lot of former Ravens like Geno Stone and Tony Jefferson were fired up about it on social media, saying how worthy Levine was in that role. Chris Horton obviously departed for New York with John Harbaugh. Special teams, though, is something in a lot of different ways that has been a backbone for the Ravens over the last many, many, many years. How has that unit held up to you over the last 2 or even just last season? And what do you hope to see in terms of changes, if any, to that unit? Maybe just in terms of the way they do things, punt coverage, kick coverage, or maybe just more explosive returns.
Okay, first of all, I think they'll figure it out in terms of the coverage. I think between the combination of Levine and Kotwicka that they'll get it correct. But I don't. I think the biggest thing is going to be a different change. It's going to be less specialization with special teams players and more special teams players who also do something else for the team. So Anthony Levine is the perfect player. Geno Stone, Tony Jefferson, all 3 of those guys had significant other defensive roles beyond what they did, for the special teams unit. They're still great special teams players. Levine in particular had the greatest season ever by a Ravens dime back in 2018. He's remembered a lot for being co-cap and captain of the special teams. But in the game at Pittsburgh in 2018, he had 3 drive-ending fourth quarter plays in the win at Pittsburgh. It doesn't get any bigger than that in terms of doing things. He had a big game against the Browns as well that year, and it was just generally outstanding in terms of what he did to defend against passes. Season ended, by the way, if you remember, 4 straight incompletes with the final one being intercepted by Mosley, and Levine had 2 of those PDs in coverage. I think in both times in coverage of Njoku too. So it was not a small thing. But anyway, I expect the guy who's most impacted by that philosophical change will be a player like Keandre Jackson. Keandre Jackson is a great special teams player, or at least it appears so from his rookie year. What he needs to now be is a good, or at least a serviceable half-field safety that could be the last guy on the roster there, the 5th to make 4, if you will, on game day, who can step in and play the back end and not force Hamilton to move to someplace they don't want to have him. Specifically off the line of scrimmage if they have a single injury. So Keandre Jackson would be the kind of player that Anthony Levine hopefully can develop into something more than just a pure special teams player.
And I was talking about, so you're talking, Ken, also about like maybe Jake Hummels, who are signed for priority special teams guys. You're sending $1 million or $2 million their way on a 1-year deal. That money gets rerouted elsewhere, essentially. And you have a guy that is going to play a handful of snaps for you on defense, but then also can become a special teams ace, right?
Yeah, well, Hummel, I would actually put in the category of he has a significant backup role already. So he came in and he played a significant amount of Mike during the season.
Right. Okay,
he was a goal line will for the team too. That went a little bit unnoticed, but he was in there on a lot of goal line plays just because he's more effective than Buchanan or Buchanan was playing on the edge, or Simpson, who was also probably playing on the edge in those plays at making tackles. So the Ravens have had that position as a specialist for a long time, by the way, going back to the days of Ed Sutter and the very first Ravens team, who had four stops on 4 consecutive plays from the 1-yard line for no gain.
The perfect guy for this is Anthony Levine, like 100%, where you want to look to a guy, you want to have a career like that, have an impact on defense, and also establish yourself on special teams and make yourself as useful as possible. Well, Anthony Levine's the perfect guy to look at his career and say, hey, this guy did it this way. Now he's my coach. I'm going to try to emulate my career off of that guy. So I'm really excited about what Anthony Levine is going to bring to the table here. But moving to the offensive side of the ball, Ken, we talked about those Broncos connections with Joe Lombardi coming in, and obviously Declan Doyle, who was the O coordinator in Chicago. He spent time with Sean Payton in both Denver and New Orleans. But the Ravens officially hired their receivers coach. The reports are out. Kerry Colbert, who was a USC star wide receiver and ended up, he was second round pick in 2004, but his career didn't really pan out, I'm sure, the way that he wanted to. But as a coach, he's coached, especially recently, some really quality guys, including Amon-Ra St. Brown, Drake London, and Michael Pittman over at USC, Ricky Pearsall over at Florida. Now he's in San Francisco. And in Denver, you saw some growth and development because that's where he was for the past 3 seasons. Cortland Sutton, you also saw some flashes from mid-round picks like a Troy Franklin and Pat Bryant. So now he's coming in as Baltimore's wide receivers coach. Ken, what can you tell everybody about this hire and what you think about it?
Yeah, I'm excited for the exact reasons you say. I think that one of the things I look at is those aren't all prototypical bodies. Now, Drake London is more of your prototypical wide receiver, the X that you think could do things like that. Michael Pittman, more, is not ideal. I mean, in a lot of ways, he's a guy who a lot of people might think of more as a back shoulder guy, but he's turned into a very good route runner. Amon-Ra St. Brown was a 4th-round pick, and he's become Amon-Ra St. Brown. I mean, he's really an outstanding player at this point. He's coached both tight ends and wide receivers, which I think is a positive. And his guys were NFL ready right when they got to the league. I mean, Pearsall had 10 yards per target this year in his second year with the 49ers. Obviously all the other names, Pittman, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Drake London, are all well on their ways to making a lot of money in this league.
This, to me, is a really exciting hire. You get the body of work that you have with Colbert, with both his playing career and who he was, particularly in college, but also having the experience in the pros, as well as working with all the guys that he has. And I think for players like Rashod Bateman, maybe getting a couple extra gears out of Zay Flowers. What about a guy like Tez Walker, though, Ken? What do you expect in a role from him? Obviously, DeAndre Hopkins could be back, could not be back. We'll see. But I feel like a Colbert pairing with Tez Walker and really working with him, I think Tez could be a real player next year for them.
Well, he's probably the biggest one from a developmental standpoint. Bateman is the route runner he needs to be right now. I'm not saying that Bateman doesn't have other things he can learn to do as a receiver better than he has so far, but Bateman basically has had this real dyadic pattern to his results that, he needs to find a way to find that consistency, as opposed to there's a whole bunch of new technique. He was a great route runner coming out of school. He's still the Ravens' best route runner in the most specific sense of that. Zay Flowers is a more dangerous route runner because he can just stick his foot in the ground and go. But Bateman is wonderful. But let's get back to Walker for a second, because I think he's the interesting developmental project. Last year they tried to do some things to get him to develop comeback routes that would complement his 7, 8, 9 routes. And the 7, 8, 9 routes have always been a strength, but you got to have something you're selling at the market, selling to that cornerback at the top of the stem in order to be able to run those routes effectively. Last year, he got behind the defense a lot, which means he's selling that better. They actually didn't throw the ball to him too much on comebacks, but they had one really big play was an 8-yard gain against the Steelers in the final game. I think it was on first down to set up 2nd and 2. That looked really good, and then they got a sack, and then they had to kick the field goal, and it was, at 44 yards ended up being too long. But the first, pass they threw was it was going after, going to Walker, which I thought was terrific. Anyway, in terms of Walker, I think there's more development there still that can happen in terms of coming back to the quarterback to get the football, and that being what will really unlock him to be the deep threat he is.
Yeah, and I think you have a really good guy now at the helm to be able to do that and help Tez really establish a role for the Ravens next season. Getting back to the special teams a little bit, though, Ken, the Ravens did hire an assistant guy, I guess, to work under now Anthony Levine, Ben Kutwicka, who is he has experience. If you want to say he doesn't, well, no, he absolutely does. He's a longtime special teams coordinator, multiple different stops. Most recently, he was the assistant special teams coach with the Rams. And then when Chase Blackburn, their special teams coordinator, was fired because, quite frankly, the Rams had a horrid special teams unit last season, this was the guy who was promoted to be their interim special teams coordinator. So again, it's not going to be his job to be the head special teams coordinator. That's Anthony Levine. But Ken, as a guy with experience behind Anthony Levine, a guy that Anthony Levine can talk to, bounce ideas off of, having that experience, how do you like this hire for Baltimore?
Love it. It's exactly what the doctor ordered. So Levine's game planning would be the biggest single concern, is that he hasn't started to do this yet. There's no doubt he's been involved, being an assistant special teams coach with Horton and whatnot, but there's a lot that goes into it. And I don't know how much Levine knows of it. I'm sure he's probably been the guy on special teams at times during his career covering kicks. And what I mean by that is the guy that you try and game plan against if you're coordinating the return. So a lot of this goes into kickoffs in particular, is that you line up your guys from L1 to L5 and R1 to R5. And you want to have a guy that you can put on L2 on one spot and then R4 on the next, and that you don't show any kind of obvious pattern that allows the opposing special teams coordinators set up the return a certain way. And so they'd have specialists they run in there. And the Ravens had guys like that covering kicks for years, who are the guy that gets moved around. And I think, Keandre Jackson may be that guy right now who's the coverage guy. Walker has some of that in him. But anyway, there'll be that to figure out. I'm not saying there's that much to do in terms of kick blocking or kicking. I actually think Randy Brown might be the guy who handles that. I don't know for a fact who's responsible for the blocking on such kicks. I think maybe the attempts to block the kick, they do have a little bit of complication to them that wouldn't necessarily be Randy Brown involved. Not that he doesn't know the theory, but he wouldn't necessarily be involved. But you're hitting on the money on the nail right on the head when you say Kutwicka is there for 18 years of NFL special teams coordinator experience. And he's a special teams coaching experience, let's put it that way. And most of that is as a coordinator with 4 different pit stops, five different special teams coordinator stops. He'll be able to at least explain any fine points of the job to Anthony Levine that he doesn't already know. And Levine is a dynasty hire. I mean, he potentially could be with the Ravens for 25 years if it really works out.
Yeah, which would be awesome. And again, we could come in as a senior assistant on special teams. So he's a guy just to bounce ideas off of, which I really, really like. And then you also have one other programming note, Prentice Gill being now an assistant wide receivers coach. He was with Baltimore for the last 2 seasons. So the Ravens staff really is taking shape. And I think it's really, really cool what they've done. And coming up in the final part of the show, we'll dive into the Ravens offseason priorities as they now look ahead to the start of free agency, which is quickly approaching. So stay tuned, plenty coming up on the show. First, this show is brought to you by FanDuel. The Winter Games are officially here, and if you're anything like us, you're locking in for events you only get to see on the biggest stage every 4 years. And that's why following the Winter Games on FanDuel just makes sense. From medal counts to individual events to finding your angle on the sports you care about most, FanDuel gives you more ways to stay connected to the action. The drama of curling matches that start slow and somehow get intense fast, speed skating races decided by inches, hockey games that feel different right from the opening face-off. Even niche events become must-watch when you're fully locked in to the competition. FanDuel keeps the entire Olympic experience engaging from start to finish, and the Olympics has so much to offer, and FanDuel has you covered with everything. The Winter Games are on, and there's no better way to follow them than with FanDuel. FanDuel, play your game. Locked on Ravens, Kevin Oestreicher, Ken McKusick, still talking Ravens football with you here. And Ken, before we talk about some offseason priorities, I do want to ask you, and I think I have an idea of who it might be. Who was your favorite hire that Jesse Minter made this offseason to his staff? Is there anybody that sticks out to you in your mind, somebody you think might help a struggling part of the Ravens team last season? Is it an assistant? Is it a coordinator? Is there one guy that stands out?
I'm almost numb to all the people right now that I've liked on this staff because it was a terrific group. I do like Anthony Weaver. I think he's a directly complementary hire. Doyle is a great risk in terms of a younger guy, and having Lombardi there is a good backup for him, much as the relationship will be between Cudwick and Anthony Levine. I think there's it's got insurance all the way across the board. It's got complementary coaching across the board, particularly in terms of the run game. I think there's so much to like about the staff. I'd have a difficulty pulling out one player. He hasn't. It's not obvious that he's hired his own replacement in this. Maybe Doyle would be the guy that they would eventually try and be ready for that. Weaver, I think, will be a head coach in the NFL at some point. Hopefully, he'll stay here 2 years, and then the Ravens will derive Rooney Rule benefits from it. If he does, and I think there's a pretty good chance that it works out that way. Great complimentary hire in terms of being around to coach defensive line, while Minter and Mickens in particular, who I love, is a great defensive backs coach. I was
thinking Mickens might have been the guy. The other guy I was thinking you might mention was Ledford, who I think is going to be a really big complimentary guy. What do you think he brings in terms of obviously the offensive line coach and what he does there, but obviously as a run game guy, I think he can add a lot more elements to what Baltimore does here.
Right. So Ledford is effectively a failed offensive lineman in the NFL. He played 7 seasons in 9 games. So he's always on the fringe of the roster. He did actually, I think he might have played in the 2003 Ravens 44-6 win over the 49ers. I think he might have been in that game because he played 8 of his 9 games that year. But as a coach, he's been extremely successful, and he's moved around and made a big impact everywhere he's played. Louisville and NC State, the college ranks, and what was the other place he was a coach for? It might have been Georgia State. I think he might have been with Minter, but I could be wrong about that. Anyway, everywhere he's gone, he's been very successful, and the run game has dramatically improved where he's gone. He'll hopefully have the players necessary to scheme up good opportunities for level 2 first contact for Henry. And then I hope Faulkner can improve Henry's missed tackle rate at that point, because that's certainly what he did for every back he coached in Pittsburgh over the years. Jalen Warren and Gainwell and Najee Harris, and there's one other that I'm not thinking of. All had missed tackle rates in excess of 0.20 for their careers with the Steelers.
Yeah, Appalachian State, I think, is the one that you might be thinking of from 2012 to 2015. So Ledford is going to be awesome for them. I'm really excited for that hire. Again, just like you said, a great complementary staff with a lot of guys that can help everybody out, helping each other out, which I think is really, really cool. But in terms of offseason priorities, Ken, obviously a lot of people right now are looking at the Lamar Jackson extension as that priority number one. Tyler Linderbaum, hopefully getting a deal with him done before the start of free agency. That for a lot of people is all right. Once Lamar's deal hopefully gets done, then Linderbaum can be the next order of business. For you though, how would you like Baltimore to kind of spend their cap room this offseason? Because like I mentioned at the beginning of the show, things that John Harbaugh and he had plans and visions for, that might not be something Jesse Minter wants to do and spend money on or have visions for. Obviously, he and Minter and DeCosta are going to work closely together. But, we've heard a lot of different rumblings. Oh, are the Ravens going to make a big splash for Max Crosby or an A.J. Brown? Are they going to go sign Trey Hendrickson or, sign a vet offensive lineman like Joe Bitonio or Wyatt Teller? What's your plan?
DeCosta told you exactly how he felt about it at the press conference. People chose not to hear it. It aligns exactly with how I think about, being GM of a football team. So I hear the message very clearly. Of course, we always hear what we want to, but DeCosta said, we're not going to make a trade like that effectively. He didn't use exactly those words, or it becomes more difficult or whatever he said. We're not going to trade, multiple first round picks and then pay an exorbitant contract. And that's exactly why you can't make these deals. And other teams do. And they generally do not work out. And when you do, you're gambling everything. And as much as the Packers thought they had a real killer move in terms of acquiring Micah Parsons, it didn't work out this year. It didn't work out for the Packers because Parsons ended up getting hurt. And that's the risk you take when you get somebody like that. And when they needed him most, he wasn't around. And that did end up mattering. I don't think the Ravens will start going in that direction. I think they've typically been a levelized performance. Make sure you get in the tournament. Occasionally you'll win one. They did that in 2012 when they had no business winning the Super Bowl as the underdog in 3 straight games by 4 points or more. It's just I think the Ravens way will persist there, and I don't believe anything about Jesse Minter having some greater voice in personnel decisions. I think if anything, the backyard Wilson talk over the fence. What's that show? Home Improvement, right? Home Improvement, yeah. That stuff is gone. I don't see anyone other than John Harbaugh having the kind of influence he had over Eric DeCosta next year in the draft or whatever. I think DeCosta will have the final say. And while it seems like he's a natural consensus builder and wants to try and challenge people on their viewpoints, but have them build to a certain conclusion that he can then get behind. I think that he's going to be making the final decision a lot more in the coming years as Minter kind of evolves into the role.
If the Ravens can have Max Crosby, but no other moves, or a Trey Hendrickson / Khalil Mack / whoever you want to throw in that category in free agency, and you can sign extra offensive line help, and you can draft someone at 14 that helps your team out, I would rather have that second option. And that's generally what the Ravens have done. Now, if a change in being a little more aggressive is they do sign a couple of guys on the first or second day of free agency and they let a couple of comp picks go, that could be a more quote unquote aggressive style change than what the Ravens have seen. But it would be in terms of trading first round picks or multiple first round picks. I'd have to see it to believe it in terms of that.
Yeah, I don't believe it's happening. I think it's much more likely they trade down again this year. The team has a huge number of needs, an enormous number of needs that go way beyond offensive line, defensive line, edge, cornerback are all major positions of need this year. They're going to have to try and address in the draft. Very likely, I think they could trade down 4 to 6 spots, pick up an extra 3rd round pick, and look pretty good for doing it. And the option is open there anyway. I think it's if you really look at the math of this, it's so prodigiously expensive to move up. I mean, just moving up like 4 spots to go to number 10, say, which would be the kind of move they need maybe to get a player that they really wanted. That will cost them a very high percentage of their remaining draft capital to do that. And I just don't see them doing that. I think it's completely counter to the Ravens' philosophy. And that draft capital in Eric DeCosta's hands, even as a lower round pick, I think is proven to be of much more value.
I'm excited for this Ravens offseason to take shape. It already has in a really positive way. A lot of, I think, positivity ever since the end of the season with how everything is shaped up so far in Baltimore. And I'm looking forward to seeing how the rest of it all unfolds. But Ken, I appreciate you. Thanks so much for hopping on the show. Before I get you out of here, tell people where they can find you and what you're working on.
Sure. At Film Study Ravens on Twitter. If you want to ask questions of me, this is oftentimes the best way during the off season is use hashtag Film Study Mailbag and a Twitter question. I'll get it on the appropriate show, or I've been doing these 1 to 3 minute videos recently on Twitter, on Reddit, they're on Instagram and Facebook. And my wife got me into doing this. I think she's onto something here, but I've been enjoying doing these anyway. And in particular, if there's something you don't understand about my writing where I need to explain something better, I'll do it in 1 to 3 minutes if I can, and I'll do it in an entire pod if I need more time. That we have Friday morning GM, and that's great for the most off-season questions, which are about acquisitions or free agency or whatnot.
Ken has so much content out there. Be sure you go support him. The links to his work will be in the description down below. Ken, I appreciate you again. Thanks so much. And thank you to everybody who watched and listened today to Locked On Ravens on the web. Be sure to like and subscribe button in video form and follow along and subscribe in audio form for 5 days a week, plus more of daily Ravens coverage coming up. We'll be back here tomorrow with another episode of Locked On Ravens. So be sure to stay tuned. I'll see you right back here soon on Locked On Ravens.